why don't I maybe start at the beginning? Because there's often a misconception that what is known as the Arab-Israeli conflict is the product of ancient hatreds, that Jews and Arabs, as they're called, have been at each other's throats since the dawn of history. But in fact, the conflict that we're discussing today and that's been in the news so much, particularly in the past year and a half, is of much more recent origin. It began in the late 19th century, and it began because the Jews of Europe were facing twin pressures. On the one hand, the pressure of anti-Semitism and persecution, which at the time was reaching unprecedented heights in the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe. And it was during this period that, for example, there was a mass emigration of Eastern European Jews, mainly to the United States, but also Western Europe and other areas in the Americas. And the other factor was the emancipation of Jews, primarily in Western Europe after the French Revolution. And so a variety of Jewish thinkers in Europe began looking at these twin pressures and trying to find a response to what at the time was known as the Jewish question. And some, for example, the ultra-Orthodox religious Jews felt that the response should be increased piety and seclusion. Others, for example, joined socialist and communist movements, thinking that this was the best way to achieve liberation for Europe's oppressed Jews. Many turned towards what today we would call liberal democracy, in which Jews would be equal citizens like everyone else in their countries and have the same rights as any other citizen and no longer be discriminated against because they were Jewish. And then in the late 19th century, you had another movement that emerged, and that was called the Zionist movement. And it basically adopted the prevailing European ideology at the time, which is that the Jews are not just a religious community, but they are also a nation, a people in the modern sense of the word, a people in its own right, just like the English or the Dutch or the Spanish are a people. And in Europe at the time, of course, if you are a people in a nation, well, then you have a state, a nation state. And the Zionist movement basically set its focus on what was then known as Palestine in the Ottoman Empire, on the basis of the ancient connection between the Jewish people and the Holy Land. So their program was to promote the emigration of Jews primarily from Europe, because they were very much focused on Europe at the time, from Europe to Palestine, which was then still an Ottoman, a possession of the Ottoman Empire. This didn't really get very far until the First World War. After the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. Palestine became a British possession, and the British then promulgated a document known as the Balfour Declaration, through which they promoted the idea of what they called a Jewish national home in Palestine. And it was really only when the British took over Palestine, what was known as the British Shield, that the idea of transforming what had been an overwhelmingly Arab territory of Palestine into an independent Jewish state began to gain traction. And it developed during the 20s and the 30s. And then, of course, you had the Second World War. You had the horrific events of the Holocaust, in which many millions of European Jews were exterminated by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. And then in the aftermath of the Second World War, when Britain really no longer had the capacity to maintain a global empire, and it decided it no longer wanted to retain Palestine as a possession, it went to the new organization that had been formed, the United Nations, and asked it to come up with a resolution for what then became known as the question of Palestine. United Nations at the time was a very different organization than it is today. It was dominated by European states. It only had about 50 members. And it came up with a proposal to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, with the exception of Jerusalem and its environs, which, because of its sanctity and unique status, would be placed under international administration. The Zionist movement accepted partition because it legitimized the concept of an independent Jewish state. The Palestinians and the Arabs rejected partition because they made up over two-thirds of the population. The Jewish community in Palestine owned less than 7% of the land, but the resolution gave them more than 50% of Palestine. And they considered it grossly unfair that as a result of armed force that they were going to have to relinquish territory that they considered rightfully theirs. Conflict broke out first between the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine, and then after the new state of Israel declared independence in May 1948, between that new state and the surrounding Arab states that were largely still under British and French colonial domination. Israel was the strongest power. It was supported in one of the few examples during the Cold War. It was supported by both the United States and the Soviet Union. It won that war, and at the end, it controlled 78% of what had been Palestine. Over three-quarters of the Arab population was dispossessed, meaning they either fled or were expelled, and just as importantly, thereafter were not permitted to return to their former homes. Most of the villages were razed to the ground. And there you had a situation where what we today know as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict became a much broader conflict between Israel and the Arab states. Additional wars were fought in 1956 and crucially in 1967, during which a superior Israel managed to defeat the combined armies of Egypt, of Syria, of Jordan, and to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the two territories that had remained under Arab control after 1948, as well as the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt and the Golan Heights of Syria. And what we're talking about today and what we've been seeing in the news in recent years is very much focused on the result of the 1967 war, because when people refer to occupied territories, they're mainly referring to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it was at the same time, in the aftermath of the 1967 war, you had the emergence of what was known as a Palestinian guerrilla movement. Palestinian guerrilla movements that operated under the umbrella organization of the PLO and began launching attacks on Israel for the purpose of ending the occupation and forcing Israel to allow the return of the refugees to their original homes. The original program, political program of the PLO, called for the Israeli state to be dismantled, and in 1969 adopted the program of a secular democratic state, whereas the previous position that all Jews who were not already in Palestine before the British got there would need to return to their original countries. Now the position of the PLO was that all those who lived there and who were entitled to live there would live together in one single democratic state. It's a proposal that never really gained much traction. And after another war, 1973, that was fought between Israel on the one hand and Egypt and Israel on the other, you began to see the emergence of what we came to be known as the two-state settlement. Two-state settlement would mean that Israel would need to withdraw from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that those two areas, which constituted 22% of mandatory Palestine, would become an independent Palestinian state. There would be a just resolution of the refugee question, and as part of that process, Arab states would recognize Israel and form normal relations with it. It's never really got off the ground for a number of reasons, the most important of which, for our purposes, is that Israel refused the principle of a withdrawal back to the 1967 boundaries. It considered the occupied territories, and particularly the West Bank, to be part of Greater Israel. It called it the historic home of the Jewish people, and felt it had more of a right to control these territories than did the Palestinians to establish their independent state there. In 1993, after a 6-year-long popular uprising by the Palestinians, Israel and the PLO reached an agreement known as the Oslo Agreements. Um, that did not specifically call for a two-state settlement, but many people believed it would lead to one. It didn't. Again, the primary reason was because Israel, although it went further than it had previously, never explicitly accepted a withdrawal back to the 1967 boundaries and the establishment within those territories of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. And it is in this context, primarily, of the failure of the political process that you began to see the emergence and growth and growing popularity of more radical Palestinian movements, particularly for purposes of today's discussion, of of an explicitly Islamist religious movement known as Hamas, which preached that it would be only through a continuation of what it called the armed struggle against Israel that Israel could be forced to accept Palestinian rights. And the failures of the political process, Hamas won an election in 2006. There was great rivalry within the Palestinian political arena, so that Hamas came to control the Gaza Strip in 2007, while the Palestinian Authority, let's call it the PLO for purposes of brevity, continued to control the West Bank. A number of wars were fought between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. A blockade was imposed on it from 2006 until today. And it is in this context of the continued failure to resolve this question in accordance with any of the international proposals that had been put forward that we are where we are today. Most recently, of course, with the attacks in southern Israel by Hamas in October 2023 that left approximately 1,100 Israelis, about two-thirds of them civilians, dead, and as of today, more than 50,000 Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians, killed in the Gaza Strip during the past year and a half.